Good afternoon, everybody. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lakehead University's 60th Anniversary President Speaker Series, and a special welcome to those of you joining us online. My name is Felix Ikoku, Vice President of Finance and Operations at Lakehead University Student Union. Before we begin, I would like to recognize the land that Lakehead University's campuses lie on. Lakehead Thunder Bay is situated on the land of the Fort William First Nations, signatory to the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850. For those of you joining us from Aurelia, I acknowledge the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, of the Chippewa Tri-Council, which include the Rama First Nation, Bisolay First Nation, and Georgina Island First Nation. Lakehead University Aurelia campus sits on Treaty 16, also known as the Lake Simcoe Purchase of 1815, and very close to Williams Treaty of 1923 and the John Collins Purchase of 1785. To begin today's gathering, in a way, I would want to recognize the long and enduring presence of many nations who have cared for the land since time immemorial. I also want to reaffirm Lakehead University's commitment to building and sustaining respectful relationships with First Nation, Métis, and Inuit peoples, relationships grounded in truth, reconciliation, and real partnership. We are grateful for the opportunity to live, learn, and work on these lands, and we remain deeply committed to continuing this work together. Just before we start, just a quick housekeeping. Just right behind me, through either your left side or your right side, are the bathrooms, and the door with the emergency sign is to my left, and that's for the emergency door. With that out of the way, Lucy is pleased to present and to partner with Lakehead University to host this important conversation during Black History Month, and to welcome our incredible speakers to Thunder Bay. I would like to welcome, I would like to also thank the African Caribbean Student Association for all their help in planning this event. And as well as the Lakehead staff, students, and faculty, and members of the Thunder Bay Communion who have come out to this event to join us in this important conversation. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jillian Siddall, President and Vice Chancellor of Lakehead University.
Thank you, Felix, and hello and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jillian Siddall, President and Vice Chancellor of Lakehead University, and I'm absolutely delighted to be inviting you or welcoming you here for this very exciting event that we have planned for you. I want to take a moment to thank Felix, Farhan, and the entire LUSU team. Today's event would not be possible without their incredible partnership. This year marks 60 years since Lakehead University's founding in 1965, a university shaped by the vision, determination, and advocacy of the people of Northwestern Ontario. Nearly 2 decades ago, the city of Aurelia brought that same spirit of possibility to Simcoe County when it welcomed Lakehead to the region. From the beginning, our story has been one of community partnership, of what becomes possible when people come together to imagine and build a better future. Today, Lakehead serves the regions and nations where we are rooted by delivering excellent education close to home, preparing students for in-demand careers, and advancing research and innovation that responds to real-world challenges. From climate change and food security to social justice, health, and the responsible use of emerging technologies, Lakehead's work is driven by a commitment to improving lives and strengthening communities. Lakehead and our communities are inseparable. We strengthen one another. That is why, to mark our 60th anniversary, we launched this public lecture series, a way to open our doors, share ideas, and say thank you to the communities who have shaped Lakehead for 6 decades. Tonight's special Black History Month presentation invites us into an important and timely conversation, Black identity in Canada and what it means for young people in an ever-radicalized world. This theme speaks directly to questions many young people are grappling with today about belonging, representation, visibility, and how identity is shaped by culture, media, politics, and lived experience. It also acknowledges the broader context we are living in, a moment of heightened polarization, rising racism, and global currents that do not stop at national borders. As we mark the 30th anniversary of Black History Month in Canada, I am glad that we are here to reflect, to listen, and to learn together. We are honored to welcome Elamin Abdelmahmoud today. Elamin is a CBC broadcaster, cultural commentator, and writer whose work explores the intersections of identity, culture, politics, and belonging. He is the host of CBC's daily arts, entertainment, and pop culture program, Commotion, and the author of Son of Elsewhere, a memoir in pieces. In his writing and broadcasting, Elamin brings thoughtfulness, curiosity, humor, and deep humanity to complex conversations, examining how stories shape us, how power operates, and how young people come to understand who they are. Having immigrated to Canada from Sudan at the age of 12, Elamin's personal journey informs much of his work, offering insight into becoming Black in Canada, navigating assimilation and unlearning, and claiming space in cultural and public life. I'm also very pleased that tonight's conversation will be hosted by our Chancellor, Dr. Rita Shelton Deverell. Dr. Shelton Deverell is an award-winning scholar, broadcaster, television producer, journalist, and theater artist. She is among the first Black women in Canada to be a television host and network executive, the first woman to lead a journalism program at a Canadian university, and a co-founder of Vision TV. Throughout her remarkable career, Dr. Shelton Deverell has been a trailblazer in Canadian media and education, creating space for underrepresented voices and championing equity, excellence, and storytelling that reflects the full diversity of our society. We are grateful for her leadership, her wisdom, and her willingness to guide tonight's conversation. At Dr. Shelton Deverell's request, I do want to disclose that she is on the board of directors for the CBC. So tonight will take the form of a fireside chat between Elamin and Rita, followed by time for audience questions. So please join me now in welcoming Elamin and Rita to the stage.
Great to see so many people here. Thank you for applauding long enough that I could get up the stairs. That's much appreciated. And of course, also welcome and thank you to people who are online, and to Elamin for being here. We both, I think, were very happy to get to Thunder Bay without too many mishaps. President Gillian mentioned your book, Son of Elsewhere, and I have enjoyed as well in the last little while, Elbows Up. Elbows Up is much more recent, as you will appreciate, and I'm going to ask a little bit about it later, but we'll start with Son of Elsewhere. And it was remarkable that my experience of being Black in Canada was almost the direct opposite. You talk about not knowing you were black until at 12 you got to Kingston, Ontario. My experience at the age of 21, immigrating to Canada in 1968, was the first time anyone referred to me as not black. And this was very surprising because I grew up in the US South, in Houston, Texas, to be precise, in the same black ghetto as George Floyd, and we went to the same high school. So I get to Canada, and a very charming, well-meaning white woman. I'm planning on going to a meeting of the Black Caucus of my graduate school, which was in New York City. And I tell her I'm going to this meeting of the Black Caucus, and she said, oh dear, you don't have to do that anymore. You're in Canada, where there's no racism, and you can just relax and be happy. I was absolutely stunned, because of course, growing up in the US South, prior to the Civil Rights Movement, you were black or you were white, and that's it. So after that long story, tell me how you have evolved on this notion of blackness.
First of all, thank you for that question and thank you for that story. That was not a long story. That was not long enough. I genuinely mean that because, first of all, it's an honor for me to be here and an honor for me to be interviewed by the Queen Bee herself. That's very generous of you. But I guess the way that I would think about that is that the context of you coming to Canada, right, 1968, you said? So like just after the centennial, right, there's a swell of celebration of what Canada is and what Canada means in that context. And a very stark juxtaposition to the people who are coming from the US to Canada because they were fleeing sort of the draft. They're fleeing having to go to Vietnam. The context for me coming to Canada is my dad left Sudan in 1995, and I didn't see him again. He left in 1994. I didn't see him again until the year 2000. And for that stretch of time, he went first to Switzerland as a political refugee, and then he came to Canada. And I didn't know that Canada was a place, right? Like, I just kind of knew it as the place where my dad was. And so I'm growing up in Sudan, and I just have the relationship that I have with my people, with my history, with the context in Sudan being that darker-skinned people, much darker skinned than I, are the ones who are labeled black. That's how racism sort of works in Sudan. Is like that's still there. That sort of racial hierarchy that we inherited from the British in Sudan. Like we sort of understood this idea of black to mean something else, and that's the sort of shadism and colorism history that's working in Sudan that is still also present, just as present here, but. It kind of worked in a different way in that when I landed in this country, I think I had a few identities that I never had to think about before, and suddenly they kind of came to the fore. And so when I sort of say that I landed in this country and then became black, what that really meant is I was handed a history. I was handed a history of the meaning of having this color of skin in this country that I didn't have. I didn't have that meaning attached to it when I grew up in Sudan. And so suddenly sort of being handed that history is like, what, is there homework involved in this? Do I have to like know significant figures, or is somebody going to sort of have an exam at the end of the month? I don't know what this means, but there's a sort of a sense of trying to grapple with your own relationship to an identity that you kind of just inherited. But the thing that grabbed my attention though is that you would have been labeled black in Texas the whole time that you were growing up there. And when you kind of come to Canada, the meaning of that blackness changes. You're still black in Canada, but the meaning of that blackness sort of changes for you. And for me, I sort of was kind of given a whole new history that I I felt like I had to begin to catch up. So in addition to learning English, I also had to learn what blackness actually meant.
Yes, and learning that history, learning the significance, Black History Month, 30 years old. So I, of course, remember when it happened and affirm it every year since. But embracing the history. You're 12 years old. When I wrote I took up playwriting as a late career. I was over 60 when I decided to write a play. And the first play I wrote was a one-woman show called Smoked Glass Ceiling. And in it, there is a scene where my son is 5 years old. And what I say I'm worried about in the play is that I'm worried that my son won't want to embrace being Black. And I'm eager to tell this 5-year-old all of the wonderful things that a brought up Black person, the advantages of that kind of strength of character. This is what the mother in me wants to impart to the child. And so I try to express that in the play. Is there a point where you embraced part or all of your own definition of being Black?
So there is, and I'll tell you that story in just a moment, but the context for it coming kind of later was that I came to Canada, but my dad had sort of set up a life for us in Kingston, Ontario. And Kingston, famously the most diverse town you've been to, right? No? Kingston's not a particularly diverse town. There's not, I was one of 4 other Black kids in my school. Like I think that's a very common experience for people in Kingston. There's not that many schools. We kind of like all know each other, you know? There's a degree of secondary alienation that sort of happens, and 12-year-old me did not decide to embrace Blackness. Did not decide to say, okay, I'm up for the task. I'm in. I'd like to take on this history and understand it. I kind of ran in the other direction, Rita. You know, I sort of did as much as I could to not draw attention to that Blackness, and that's how I sort of spent much of high school and the start of my university years, because it felt and probably was too much, you know, for that period of time. I didn't know where to even begin. And so the experience that sort of turns us around a little bit is I'm in second year university, and there is somebody who runs a magazine, and the magazine is called Culture Shock. And she comes up to me and she says, hey, we are having a meeting. This magazine's for people who are like us. And so she just sort of saw me as a part of an us. And she was a Black woman who ran this magazine, and she didn't ask me anything about my history. She just kind of was like, hey, having that skin color makes you a part of this community. It makes you a part of the people who are trying to figure out what it means to be Black at Queen's University, and writing about it and thinking about it. And that was, I would say, like, that was sort of the starting point of me going, I gotta sort of get a handle on this identity, what it means to me, because it is a part of who I am. It's a part of how I'm seen, and spending all this time running away from it is just not going to do anybody any good.
That is a very moving story, actually. It's always wonderful when someone embraces you, whose group you want to be a part of, or think of yourself as being a part of. Moving forward in time with my playwriting career, for 3 years, I was a visiting professor of women's studies at Mount St. Vincent University in Halifax. So this was 2009, 2012. And I had a number of young students, university-age students, who were, at appearance, light-skinned black people, and were so racially uncertain that they had lots of trouble saying, "I am black." And I didn't understand this for the reasons I stated earlier. I grew up in a world where you were black or you were white, and although we had the shadeism within the community, we definitely had the shadeism, that didn't amount to a discounting of your identity. So I was trying to understand this and and I didn't understand it. And one of my very fine colleagues, who was black and was at King's College, said, "You've got to stop being so upset about this. Why don't you write something and try to understand it?" So we're now at 2019. I did write a play called "Who You Calling Black, Eh?" And it tried to get at what was bothering and what would be the solution.
Did you find one?
I think the play found its solution. But what I'm wondering, since the mixed race, I'm not quite black, I'm not quite white, I'm all confused, was a new thing for me. Did you or do you see mixed race as being an increasing problem?
Let me put it like this. We're currently sitting on a stage where behind me there's Bob Marley, there's Prince, there's Hendrix, I think, over there, right? Thank you. I'm like, I can't see. I think we like to think that our identities are sort of fixed relationships that are innate, but I'm not sure that they are. I actually think that they come, quite often they're constructed through the images around us. I mean, like, that's why I'm in pop culture for a living. I think I'm interested in the ways that pop culture sort of constructs and reconstructs the world around us all the time. We take cues from the movies that we see, the music that we listen to, the TV shows that we watch, that are constantly informing and reinforming our ideas of ourselves. And sometimes that's sort of explicit, sometimes that's a bit more implicit. But, you know, when I came to Canada and was handed this identity of black, right? I think it's natural to go, okay, that's what this skin color sort of means here. Shouldn't that be obvious? But the images that I was seeing around me of what blackness meant were images that I had a hard time relating to. And so I say this as someone who was like living in Kingston, right? The only places I saw blackness were on TV, which meant I saw a lot of Ja Rule, you know? I saw a lot of 50 Cent. Not a big fan of Ja Rule. 50 Cent's all right. But there is like a degree of seeing those images and seeing that relationship. And like, I had grown up in a conservative Muslim country. And so to me, actually, like, those music videos were shocking to my, like, you know, 12-year-old self sensibilities. And there was like a rebellion. There was like a sense of like, if that's what blackness means, I don't think I can be a part of this thing. And so when you're sort of considering yourself to be a member of a group, I think part of that also means considering yourself to be a part of the pop culture construction of that group, and figuring out whether that sits well with you, whether you actually like really actively reject it. Those are not conscious decisions we make. You know, at 12 years old, you're told, you know, this is the meaning of this word, and these are the images that are associated with it. I think when you grow up and get a little older and a little more able to sort of find images, reference points of your own, then you can sort of figure out your own relationship to those identities that are not fixed in this larger, capital B black construction of the idea. And I actually like, it's particularly acute for you because I do think living in Canada, maybe the monolithic idea of what it means to be black is inherited from America quite often, right? Like I think Canadian blackness struggles at times to distinguish itself from American blackness, and there are moments where we really succeed in doing so, and there are moments when it's hard. It's hard because we live directly next to the largest cultural producer in the world. They make so much culture, and we allow so much of it into this country, and we talk about it as though we made it, but we didn't. And I think there's a danger in adopting cultural narratives that are not your own, and we don't always see that danger, I think.
I'm thinking, I said I had this struggle in Halifax, which is to say in the place where there is the largest indigenous black population
and
in
oldest.
Canada, oldest, and that may be why, that may have contributed to something I hadn't experienced before, which was all this distress.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. I'll have to add that to the script. Who You're Calling Black has actually continued because of the pandemic. I was able to do a digital version of the play. One of the actors calls it the gift that goes on giving because of that. However, I'm going to stick with pop culture. So, I've confessed to Lakehead that I know nothing about athletics, and now I have to confess that I know next to nothing about pop culture, even though I listen to your show and I enjoy it. Yeah. And I think, oh, those people are talking about things I don't know anything about. Isn't that wonderful? Yeah. But here's what I do know. Bad Bunny did the Super Bowl intermission, halftime
show.
Halftime. Yeah. In terms of the world that we're living in right now, did that help? Did that hinder?
The ways that people have talked about this Bad Bunny halftime show have been like, it's like the exhale that people have been waiting for from, after like a really long time of holding your breath. I think there's beauty and there's power in that, right? There's beauty and power in a figure that you see, someone like Bad Bunny, who's kind of been pretty explicitly anti-Trump in terms of his policies, but also very explicitly pro-Puerto Rico, pro his homeland. And so much of what he's done has been for Puerto Rico and for the uplifting of Puerto Rico in a moment when, there's not a lot of other people who are doing that. And so for him to sort of stage that entire halftime show as a celebration of his culture felt like sort of enables other people to do the same thing. There's also, he did end his little speech with God Bless America, and he named every country in all of the Americas, ending in Canada, and Canadians were very excited about this. But it's the best. But there is, what that tells me though, is like there is this hunger, right? There's this hunger that people are having for an ease of celebrating love and celebrating like the people that you love and their willingness to hold you up. And especially in a cultural moment like this one, especially when you are seeing images of the protests, for example, in Minnesota, if you see the images that you're seeing in Palestine, the images that you're seeing in Ukraine, like there's a relief to be found, in someone who's trying to say, yeah, I do oppose all of the horrors in the world, but actually the ways to do so, it's not anger, it's to stage a literal live wedding. The people who got married during the halftime show, they were actually like a real couple who got married on stage, which is like, can you imagine? Like the whole world witnessed your wedding. What a beautiful and delightful thing that is. But actually, like, to me, that's actually just the function of culture. That's a function of what pop culture does in this world. You know, the biggest show on the planet, the biggest television show on the planet is Heated Rivalry, which is a Canadian television show. The ways that people have needed a show like Heated Rivalry to say, oh, I've not seen a queer love story done like this one before, with its willingness to commit to the sex as much as it is willing to commit to the yearning in it. That tells me that like there is this like hunger for just like boldly and genuinely expressing really big joy in a moment like this one. And that contrasts with the size of the horrors, right? I think like there is like the larger and more horrifying the awful stuff is, the more you're likely to cling to someone like a Bad Bunny or like a Heated Rivalry. I think like they'll function as like, oh, that's not a TV show that I'm watching. That's medicine, you know? That's something that I'm gonna go to because it's gonna heal something for me a little bit.
Which brings me to Elbows Up, actually. Every 10 years or so, I would have a nightmare. I call them escape dreams. And usually this would be when I was having some kind of bad thing in a work situation. And I would have my dream and I would escape from wherever it was, and then a gate would come down and I'd be protected from the bad thing. Since the second regime started to the south of us, in my escape dreams, I don't escape. Which means that I had always thought of Canada as an escape from the US. That's how I interpret my own dreams.
I trust you on that.
Yeah, I think it's probably right. Which I never envisioned a time when Canada would not be the escape from some really bad stuff. I just never thought of this as a possibility. So Elbows Up, Elamin's second book, for those of you who haven't seen it, is an anthology of first essays that were published in 1968, following the centennial, they're all on the relationship of Canada to the US. So we have 1968, and we have now essays that have just been published. And it's quite moving. When I said my immigration year was 1968, I was wrong. It was 1967. So it was
actually during Expo, during Centennial
year, when Canada had this real burst of "We are wonderful," and it's very moving to read these essays. My first question, though, is why was this your subject? Why is this your subject?
So Elbows Up came out in October of last year, but we started assembling it pretty early on in the year. I think like the first conversation we had about it, you know, Trump was sort of making all these 51st state threats, and they started in February. By March, we're like, should we pull together an anthology of Canadian writers to comment about this? And it wasn't initially my idea. It was the idea of Stephanie Sinclair. She's a publisher of McClellan Stewart, and she had under her publishing purview this book that came out in 1968, actually. It's called The New Romans. Al Purdy edited, and in it you have the who's who of Canadian writers in 1968. You know, you have Farley Mowat, you have Michael Ondaatje, you have Margaret Atwood, you have Margaret Lawrence, you have all the greats. And the subject of that book is Canadians giving their candid opinions of the United States. And what's really shocking about the New Romans, about that collection, is that as how many of our greats at the time thought that it was actually kind of inevitable that eventually America would just swallow Canada whole. I think like Mordecai Richler was like, we have nothing to worry about because it is inevitable. Like at a certain point, it's just going to happen. Farley Mowat, in his piece, he talks about the Yankee succubus will eventually consume Canada. So there wasn't necessarily a tone of anxiety. There was some frustration and anger, but there wasn't so much anxiety. I think our cultural moment called for maybe something a little bit different. And it's funny that you came in '67 because coming in '67 is like you arrived at right at the start of one of the greatest booms culturally that this country has ever had, maybe the best boom this country's ever had, which is like the late 60s onto the early to mid 70s of so many gigantic Canadian cultural institutions were created to be like, how do we tell Canadian stories? How do we preserve Canadian culture? Funnily enough, as a response to, Lament for a Nation, which came out a few years before that, where Grant had basically just said, Canada is no longer fighting for itself. Canada stopped sort of the willingness to sort of fight for itself. And so in the 70s, you get all of these gigantic TV shows, all these massive movies that were made in this country. We just lost Catherine O'Hara. Like that entire generation of comics, they were forged because these broadcasters had money, and they said, okay, let's make things. Let's make things that are based here and built here. It felt impossible to me, and to Stephanie, and to the other people who were sort of involved in that project, that our writers of this moment would have nothing to say about that threat that has always been looming, but is now kind of knocking at the door. And so we thought, why don't we ask them? Why don't we ask some Canadian writers what they think? And with the caveat that we're going to try to put this book out really quickly. So we put the ask out April 1st, and we said, hey, do you want to be involved in this thing? By the way, you've got about 5 minutes to write a piece. I think we gave them a total of 6 weeks deadline, which if you have met writers, that's their worst nightmare, and so many people said yes. So many people said yes, and actually so many people said, I really want to be involved in this thing, but I can't make that deadline. That's a little bit too quick. There are people we've had to say, we can't fit you in if you can't make that deadline, that I'm like, they're dream people to publish. But there was a swell of energy. There was a swell of energy of Canadian writers saying, I think I have something to say about this, Omar Lakehead wrote this incredible piece. He's one of the earliest pieces you see in the book, and his piece is about how do you reckon with American power as you watch a genocide unfold in Palestine, and what does it mean for us to just sort of be at the whim of this country that is kind of right there all the time. Kinesia Lubrin bookends that entire collection with a piece that says, well, what's the purpose and what's the point of the nation state in this moment right now? Because this fragility and this fear that you feel feels inevitable as long as you're so dependent on this construction. But my favorite piece in the entire collection is a piece from Carol Off, the great Carol Off. And Carol Off sort of wrote about how in the 80s, during the NAFTA negotiations, there were actually quite a few people saying, hold on a second. When you negotiate with America, don't give away Canadian culture, right? Like the lumber, fine. Cars, fine. Culture, no. That should be not available. And what Carol does, kind of painstakingly, is recreate the ways that we lost a lot of access to Canadian culture. So now, we live in a country that is one of the leading countries in terms of producing American films. So many of them are made here. So many American TV shows are made here. There are so many of them. Like Toronto, Hamilton, Vancouver, all the time. Any street that you turn down, there's somebody shooting something. It's not Canadian. The product itself is not Canadian. The money for it is not going to stay in Canada. It's going to go back to the United States. It's going to go to a Disney or a Netflix or an HBO. They're happy to take the tax credits, to make something here, but it's not something that is made in this country. even though we have some of the best professionals in that industry. So the core argument is, hey, if we are going to protect this culture, what does that look like and what does that mean? You know, and what are the questions that we got to be asking ourselves? You know, one of my favorite pieces, if Carol Off is my favorite piece, I think one of my favorite pieces is the actor Jay Baruchel, who is, I mean, it's a blistering piece, and it's funny to sort of see Jay now because he's doing all these Olympic ads. So like as you sort of watch the Olympics, like Jay is one of the faces of the Olympics. But it's a deeply thoughtful and also deeply furious piece that says, hey, how is it possible that one of the most powerful mediums on the planet, film, is a medium that Canada has kind of like ceded, you know, its place in? Why would we do that to ourselves? Why are we not obsessed with telling our own stories? And why, and how do we actually like return to that? And so I think what I got out of this collection is there's a new set of questions being assembled for us as a country. And I don't know where those questions go. I don't know how we answer them even. But it's nice to have new questions. I think that's what this moment has given us, is a new set of questions.
The Carol Off piece is very moving. And she and others have been asking those questions from 1968 until now. As a matter of fact, I was on the board of it was called the the Ontario Media Development Corporation is what it was called at the time. So this must have been in the 80s. And so there I am on the board, and there are two other artists, but everybody else is a money person. And they literally could not see the problem with our becoming a branch plant in terms of production. Only the artist on the board could see this as a problem, as Carol Off.
Because we could have a very successful industry making American movies for the rest of our time as a country. We can. Is that the life that we want? Is that the kind of story? Are these the kind of stories we want to tell?
Well,
You know?
now since the situation has changed with the big streamers and so on, that's why there's so much talk about how to protect the revenue.
Yes.
Which brings me to CBC. Now, you heard my full disclosure that I'm on the board, and I always preface this with, I'm not on the board at the CBC because my life with them has been all butterflies and rainbows. As a matter of fact, I have, in my history, filed a union grievance against the CBC for discrimination. I'm on the board because I believe in the institution. And whatever I can do at this moment, I want to do for all the reasons you just stated, including that CBC used to have a lot of American-looking stuff, and now that's completely flipped around. So, so with that preamble, it's not because it's perfect, but it's because it's a deeply important cultural institution. How do you see, in terms of issues of discrimination, representation, content, whatever terms you want to use, how much is this better? How much is backlash happening? How much are you uncomfortable? There are lots of questions one can ask about media.
I've been at the CBC in some kind of capacity since 2019. But this most recent show, and I've been full-time at the CBC for about 3 years. It's a relatively recent history. And my experience of that place is I'm regularly engaged with, I think, people above me, like people in management, who are asking really interesting questions. They're asking really interesting questions about who is the audience that CBC needs to serve. And it's a recurring question, obviously. And the ways that it keeps recurring is, as Canada keeps changing, they have to balance the demand of people who have always thought the CBCs for them and people who have never thought the CBCs for them. And how do you grow to meet these people? And I say that as like, I speak to a lot of newcomers to this country. I was one of those newcomers for whom CBC was like a lifeline. You know, it was like the way to understand the country. I don't know if that's necessarily true right now, right? I don't know if that's necessarily true in this moment. Is that an audience that CBC wants to go after? And if so, how are they going to do it? I think like that is one of the questions that we keep asking ourselves as a show, because like that's the part of the CBC where I have even a little bit of influence in it. And so that has to do with our programming choices, right? That has to do with the ways that we choose what we cover on the show. That means that our producers are constantly thinking about those questions before they walk into a pitch meeting, right? Like before they walk into a pitch meeting, they're thinking about, hey, who's a new audience member who we could find by doing the story? Because by doing that story, what we're really saying is CBC can also be for you, right? And that's a part of the machine that I exist in. But I also like do watch other shows who are, I think, doing new things that I'm excited about in terms of how they want to like answer those questions. You know, The Current, for example, has been doing this traveling on the road thing for the last little while into communities that they don't normally go into, or The Current has not gone into for some time. That feels like it's a new way to reach people who don't feel represented by the CBC. And by the way, when we talk about representation CBC, that does include people who want to defund the CBC, right? Like they don't feel particularly represented by the CBC. And for at least a little while, that was one of the great sort of rallying cries of the Conservative Party, at least like for the last couple of elections.
I recall it.
Yeah, you might remember that. You might remember that that happened. But like that was also a conversation that we had on our show. You know, we invited 3 critics of the CBC on our show to say, okay, let's hear it. Let's hear where this institution is sort of falling short. They made some points. I agreed with some of them. I disagreed with some of them. But also, I think, like, learning to be a little bit fearless about having those conversations will make you better as a show and as an institution. That fearlessness is something that it takes some time to sort of like take hold. But I think we're getting there. I think we're working on it anyway.
Yes, the idea of attracting the unaffiliated is a very important concept, and I see a fair amount of energy going into it, and it makes me quite happy. But what also makes me happy is the Carol Off position. That cultural institutions, and it was wonderful that both the Prime Minister and the Minister of what it's called now, Canadian Heritage, were at the Prime Time conference,
Yeah, that's
which
a
is
big TV
basically
conference.
television producers, and really affirmed the work that people do. In fact, the Prime Minister was quite funny because he said he was a politician and he was quite willing to take credit for things he had nothing to do with.
Yeah,
So-
like heated rivalry. I think he took credit for it on stage. It was
Yes.
a great little moment.
And since he had absolutely nothing to do with it, it was really very humorous and very knowledgeable at the same time. One other essay in the book, though, is the one, now can I remember the name of it, or did I write it down? The Promises We Keep. And that essay is written by a Chinese heritage person who is talking about her grandfather, her great-grandfather, and her grandfather, having grown up with the head tax, the Chinese Exclusion Act, and all kinds of things that they didn't talk about. And she's working around to why the country is so important to her now, and why she is going to teach her children how important it is. That essay moved me quite a lot, actually, because I think the idea of how you love the place in spite of. So how are you feeling about that?
That essay is by Jen Suk-Fan Lee, and she's a terrific writer. She's also an editor at ECW Press, one of the last great independents in this country. Jen was sort of working through, how do I put this? I think she was working her way to tenderness, if you will. I sort of like read that piece as, hey, I know we're beginning from a callous place. I know that like there's an air and an atmosphere of really difficult things that my family has experienced, my grandfather's experienced, that they don't come up. We don't talk about them in this house, right? Like they're present, but they're not explicit. And when you have that in the house, when you have that in the atmosphere, it of course shapes your relationship with the country. It shapes your relationship with the idea. But also, she saw in her family this perseverance and this willingness to say, we're going to stay, and we're going to do what we can to make this place better. And so and then she sort of works through her own relationship to that idea, and how do you sort of arrive at owning your role in that. And I sort of think about this, a lot. I have a 9-year-old, and when I sort of think about the future that my kid is going to have, so much of the work that I do now, it's very easy to sort of get caught up in the idea of wanting to see results in your lifetime, I think that can be also very, very ego-feeding. Kind of like, I put in this work, and now I get to see the results. But that's never been the way that anything changes, right? Like the goal should be to say, we started this project and this process now, and the work will outlive us, and that's okay, right? Like it's okay that my job is to get the ball from here to here, not get it across the whole field. Like that's not the job. The job of the time that I have, and the job that I have, and the current position that I occupy, is to know that the amount that I'm going to move the needle is probably not going to be noticeable. But what you're doing is building a scaffolding for the next generation to have a different relationship with that institution, or with that concept, or indeed with a country. And I think to me, Jen, what she did is she sort of saw her place in that link, right? She saw her place in being like, it's not about saying, hey, I am going to personally change my entire family's relationship with this country. It's about figuring out, being like, what's the thing that I can do to make this place a little more just, a little more hospitable? Understanding that you don't necessarily get to reap the benefit. You just know that someone will, and that needs to be enough. And that's actually it's okay for that to be the case.
It's a very thought-provoking essay, and thank you and the editors for including it. Yeah. An increasingly radicalized world. What that meant to me is something about social media. That the unfortunate ideas have always been there, but never have they been spread so fast and with so much fake news, and with people still being seemingly very angry from the pandemic and more violence. But how do you protect in a more radicalized world?
Just a really easy question there, Rita. Hey, thank you.
Yeah.
And let me start here. Does anyone remember when you used to be able to reach the end of Instagram? Hands up. Okay, like a few hands, but not everybody. There used to be a time, right, like when you open the app, and then you'd get to the end, and then that's it. There were no more photos to be served because that's what everyone had kind of uploaded recently. Yeah, that changed. That was a deliberate change that changed in 2017. They changed in 2017, and it sort of two changes. First change was it became algorithmic. So it wasn't before. It was like literally just like, here's the order of photos that were posted. Your friend Bob, your friend Matt, your friend Chelsea. You know, it was kind of like, this is the order of the photos that were posted. You're done now. Go do something else. And then 2017, they're like, well, hold on a minute. What if we showed you a photo from 5 days ago that you didn't get to see, actually? And suddenly your timeline was a little bit out of order and an entirely different sort of thing. Then the second change that they introduced, inspired by the slot machine, is the infinite scroll. And so as you're scrolling, if you just kind of click a little thing and then it just refreshes and goes, here's a whole bunch of new photos. You haven't seen any of these, have you? And what it does to your brain is go like, oh, there's more. There's more of this thing. It just kind of keeps pulling you. And I am also of the generation that remembers overnight the change when Facebook introduced the news feed. Facebook, there was a time when it was just like, here's a page, people write on your walls and they go, oh, you smell, you know? And then like that was the end of it. And then they introduced this function called the news feed, and again overnight, that was in 2006, and overnight it was like, oh, this is a bit creepy. I can see what everyone is up to. I can see them posting about things. I can see what photos they liked. I can see what news articles they're reading. And then the last change I'm going to mention is this change that happened on Twitter, and it happened in the year 2011. And it's one person who was like, oh, people keep wanting to share messages. Let's invent a retweet button. And so there was no retweet button. Twitter OGs will remember the period of time when you had to, in order to share a message, you had to copy it and paste it, and there was no character limit. There was a character limit, so you couldn't just add whatever you wanted on top of it. I mentioned these three inventions, the infinite scroll, the newsfeed, and the retweet button, because all three of the people, the coders who invented those, said sorry. They were like, whoops, we may have broken democracy. You know, I think like one thing that we take for granted is that the world we inhabit, especially on our phones, is constructed by people whose ethos is not like, hey, here's information that's beautiful that you should see and you should probably engage with it. Please have it. They're interested in your attention, right? They're interested in your attention as a commodity, as like a thing they can buy and sell. And the shift from your attention being like, hey, here's the most exciting thing, please watch it on TV, to, well, how long can we keep your eyeballs on a screen? We are barely beginning to sort of process the end, the meaning of that. You know, the big Marshall McLuhan quote that the medium is the message was never about television specifically. It was about the fact that whatever medium you engage with, the ways it is changing your brain is the most important thing. Forget anything that you're consuming on it. Forget the shows that you're watching on TV. The fact that TV is teaching you to think differently matters. Forget what you're seeing on your phone. The fact that the fact that you're seeing on your phone is changing your brain, and that's the thing that matters. And so when we talk about this radicalization idea, when we talk about the widespread, particularly intense radicalization when it comes to the stuff that I particularly see is really, really gross misogyny that seems to be getting more and more extreme and more intense online. So much of it is based in these modes of like, how do these people keep your attention? They're really trying to keep your attention, and so they keep sort of ratcheting it up, the thing that they have to say, in order to attract more people. Then the algorithm says, whoa, a lot of people are watching this video, maybe we should serve it to more people. And that's how incredibly radical ideas that like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you would have said, that has no place anywhere in the middle of society. You know, it should be at the very far edges, have just found more and more audiences. They are literally playing attention Olympics, and we're all losing, and they're all on the podium. And there is something really difficult, I think, about grappling with the fact that we are up against forces that our brains can barely compete against. And I say this as someone who, I was on Instagram right before I hopped on the stage, Rita. You know, I too am a part of this thing. And so figuring out how to extract ourselves from a cycle where it's your attention that's for sale, I don't know if that's easily doable, but that's going to be the challenge of the century.
Well, it is a primary reason for not giving away media and giving away culture that functions differently.
Yeah.
I mean, the amount of fake news that happens is extraordinary, and the speed with which it happens is extraordinary. One more question, which is about Sudan. I find that all I know is the comment that the world has forgotten Sudan. I have. It's not on my mind like Ukraine and like Palestine and Israel, like the United States. What part of your consciousness is in Sudan?
I got my first tattoo a couple months ago. It's right here. It's a hibiscus flower. It's a national flower of Sudan. I still have family in Sudan, and family who have very recently left Sudan because of the war. And so I'm in constant conversation with my parents, with those family members, and we're getting sort of like the updates all the time. I think the idea of the world has forgotten about Sudan, I'm not entirely sure if that's fair. I think it's closer to the idea that, like, I think people don't know, right? They don't know about what's happening in Sudan, partly because it does not lend itself to a lot of narrative clarity, right? It's a civil war that has erupted because of two factions of warring militaries, a military and a militia, that were going to unite. And then right before uniting, they decided that, you know, the militia decided that, you know what, they tried to seize power. It is also a proxy war, and it's like very difficult to explain to people. They're like, well, you have UAE arming this faction, and you have these people arming this faction. And I think the attention span for explaining a conflict that's as complex as Sudan is difficult to sustain, you know? And is that frustrating? It is. But I also have to acknowledge that, like, it's much harder to explain what's happening in Sudan than it is to explain what's happening in Ukraine, for example. And so the thing that what I've seen other Sudanese people do is say, would you please invest the time in learning? I know it's not as simple as the other conflicts, but take a minute. Take a minute to sort of like read about this conflict, read about what's happening right now, and then figure out where you can make a difference, right? So like one of the conversations that we were having in this country is there are Canadian arms manufacturers whose weapons keep showing up in Sudan. As far as we know, like legally speaking, the Canadian government will tell you, well, that's not allowed. We don't know how that actually happened. But no one knows what the next step is in terms of how to stop this, because are these weapons being sold to an intermediary that is known to selling it to militias in Sudan? I don't know. I think there's some reporting on this, but a lot of it is speculation. And I don't want to speculate, but there's a level of like, if we could be engaged in this, to say like, you should care about this problem as much as you care about Palestine. I think it would encourage a lot of people to just like read more about it, because I'm really heartened. By the way, I think one of the heartening things that I've seen is, I think people now know more about Palestine than they did, 4 or 5 years ago. I think that's actually how the world changes, is people learn about the nature of a problem, and they learn the language that's involved in that problem, and then they figure out where their place is for engagement. I think having learned about Sudan now is not a problem. I think like the best time to learn about Sudan was a couple of years ago. The next best time is now, and I don't take that for granted at all.
That's a good thing about the speed of information.
Yeah.
I've had a lot of freedom of questioning, and I'm going to ask you if you have questions, comments. I don't know if we have an ability to get questions from people online. We do. My goodness, this is a lot of technology. And I'm sorry that I haven't been looking at the balcony over here. You're obviously there, so you can be included. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and we will. Looks like Jillian is going to say something.
Well, just to let folks know that there are 2 microphones here. So if you do have a question, come on up to one of the mics and use that to ask your question. And I know we have a way to do it online, and I'm just glancing around the room for
Don't be shy.
Nikki, who I think is going to be able to facilitate that. Oh, Clay is going to facilitate that. Okay, awesome.
So,
Hey, we owe one person.
there is a brave person.
Not brave. So my question is, with the rise of social media and the instantaneous of all of it and the instant gratification, how do we learn to listen to differing opinions, different lived experience, so that we can actually engage in that town square that Twitter used to be, and like actually understand where people are coming from and those lived experiences, whether you're coming from the South or from Sudan or wherever else?
Thanks for the question. I'm 37. I turned 38 in in like 3 weeks. That puts me in the prime demographic to believe in that Twitter as public square dream that was maybe alive between 2008 and 2015. It was a beautiful time. It's dead. And I think we can maybe mourn it, and then figure out how to sort of build a real life public square. I think like there was, with all of these tools, right? Like there was a time of maybe believing in, benevolence is not the word, but goodwill, that's how we're saying, good intent of these gigantic sort of tech companies, and I would include myself as among those optimists. I think like there was a thought that like this is gonna work out great, we'll be able to meet each other there, and it will resemble what the world looks like, and we'll have ideas that we'll be able to share, and there'll be joy, the same kind of joy that we can create in community here. We can have that there too. The minute that profit became the sort of, it was always a motivation, but the minute that profit sort of became at the center of all these things, I think that shifted the possibilities of what can even be achievable in that direction, right? And so you have multiple conflicts where misinformation, disinformation performs so much better on Facebook than it does, than the real news does. We are also like living in a country right now where you can't see the news on Facebook. So that there's a lot of fake news websites that are really prospering because of that. Twitter was good. I think it was maybe the one that I believed in the most, to be honest with you. But then 2016 happened, and it really changed the atmosphere of what Twitter was capable of. And there were several years where I think, like, if you were on Twitter, it meant sort of trying to bat back that possibility of sort of this evil taking it over. I think with Elon Musk buying it, like, there is no... His politics are pretty explicit. The ways that he talks about a lot of different groups are pretty explicit. And that has, like, woven itself into the way the platform operates. I don't think that's a secret to anybody. So it's a question of, like, will there be new tools? Or is it kind of a wake-up call, actually, to say that the best public square we've always had is still this one, right? It's still the sort of the ability to gather people in front of you and say, I don't know about this, I'm a little bit uncomfortable, but I'd like to sort of, like, work through this discomfort in public with other people. My worry is that we've lost that training to ability to sort of, like, withstand what it means for someone to disagree with you in real life. Because the other thing that social media networks have done has been like, wow, you really feel good when we show you a post about someone who's angry about the same things that you're angry about. And that's really good for engagement. It's not good for building a world, for sort of being able to sustain the necessary discomfort of building community with other people who are gonna, like, agree with you on 4 things and disagree with you on another 5. And you go, wow, can we get something done on the other 4, you know? It's a muscle, right? It's a muscle it's a civic muscle. And the thing that you need to build it, we almost always want it to be some kind of, like, new and emerging digital tool where people talk a little differently, and maybe it's blue sky, you know? But I'm not entirely convinced that the solution to that is digital. I think there's a benefit to reducing the size of the world, because what social media has done is made us think that we all live everywhere all the time, and it's made us forget about the very local problems that you and I can get together today and call 5 other people, and actually, like, that will move some kind of needle. That those problems are very local, and forgetting what the local is the first thing, like, the local is the first thing that goes when you sort of consider yourself to be a citizen of social media. So, yeah.
I want to add 2 things to that. One is another book recommendation that I heard on the Sunday morning show on CBC Radio. The book is called How to Do Nothing. And
Jenny Odell, great book. Yeah.
It is absolutely, and it's not about how to do nothing. It's about how not to build your life around all of these electronic sources of information. The second thing I wanted to add is I remember being shocked, since I've spent a lot of time teaching journalism students, when students stopped believing that you could get information by talking to people, by interviewing them. It was almost like when you got to the chapters in the class about interviewing, they would look at you like you had flipped out. Because the information was going to all come from the internet. Talking to people was not anything important. Yeah. So I think it probably is still very important. I think you were going to...
My question's sort of the same kind of question. She beat me to it. Sort of, I grew up where we had media that you might not agree with, but at least you trusted it, that it was real, actual, factual news. And I find now you don't know what to trust anymore. We're losing newspapers, we're losing media that isn't one side or the other. We're so divisive in so many ways. Where do we start? And you're talking about doing things locally, and I agree with that. But I also see my parliament behaving like children in a sandbox, and arguing and not getting anything accomplished. How do we get them to demonstrate and be responsible role models? Or even our city council. I can't vouch for what happens in our council here, but you hear about councils that don't function. They're just arguing and nothing gets done. And how do we get them to stop being those children?
Well, if I could solve that one, I'd run for prime minister tomorrow, you know? But I will say that, like, there's this aspect of performance to politics that it's not new, but it's accelerating, right? Like, you can sort of see politicians playing to the clip that's going to be shared on social media. You see this all the time. And in fact, the better a politician is at that, the more renowned they're going to have. The more sort of, you know, the more likely they are to kind of go viral. But there is something to be said about reminding people that at no point, actually, has that been the thing that you're asking for. You're not asking them to sort of like appear on television performing a role. You actually just want to be heard. Like that's what politics kind of always has been. Karoloff, speaking of Karoloff, her book that came out last year is entirely about this, right? It's about sort of how do you, in a fake news environment, how do you restore trust in institutions? And how do you sort of return yourself to a world where, what is the thing that you know is true? Because you need that through reporting. And then, more importantly, why do you feel so disempowered? And disempowerment is a strategy, right? Like, disempowerment is like a very powerful sort of force that we all feel. We kind of go like, oh, we're all helpless and we don't really know what to do about any of those things. That's not entirely true. I think like particularly with politicians, especially with local politicians, politicians tend to be pretty nervous creatures. I think like the showing up with a certain number of people and making sure that like you go like, we are watching you very closely. We're really invested in the ways that you show up as a politician. Will make them stop paying attention to all the people on social media who are like, hey, you're doing a great job. Thank you for fighting the way that you're fighting, and make them a bit more engaged with their constituents, kind of a bit more directly. We've seen some success with this in Toronto. I feel like there's been a few Toronto city councillors who I would say they were behaving in ways I'm like, I don't know who this is for, but it feels like it's really performing for a social media audience. And some like local groups have kind of gotten together and said, come on, can you tend to this problem, this problem, this problem? That's actually what we really want from you. And I think they've been a little bit responsive, but I don't know how to solve that problem without taking away that grand stage that is available to all those politicians, because they seem to be, trying to make a name for themselves. Were you coming up for a question?
Yes. Hello. Sorry, can you guys hear me? I wrote it down so that I wouldn't forget, but I want to say thank you, Elamin and Dr. Rita, for the conversation and your wealth of knowledge between you guys. So my question was, as people who emigrated to Canada at different points, I guess in your lives, and also at different points in the world, because you guys came to Canada in times that are way different from current times, I guess. How did you learn to be like fully in your blackness? I guess the way I term it is to breathe, because I find that I immigrated to Canada 3 years ago, and there's always this consciousness of blackness that doesn't always feel the best,
Where'd you come from?
Nigeria. Okay. That feeling of other, and like the topic says, Black identity in Canada, and what it means for people, young people in an ever-radicalized world. That feeling of other becomes more apparent, whether it's in social media or, Canada isn't as intense, but, in the world, does it get easier, So I hope that makes sense.
I love that question. Thank you. Rita, I mean, like, I feel like for you, coming in 1967, like, it would have been a different environment, because also you're coming with this history of American blackness. You don't have to seek a lot of other sources to feel assured in your own blackness. It just was a fact of your existence. I think like when I came, it was 2000, and coming to Kingston shaped so much of my relationship with that initial blackness sort of rejection, you know? It was very easy for me to be sort of shaken kind of out of it. Honestly, it took somebody else claiming me, right? It took somebody else saying like, no, I don't feel conflict with the way that you are black and the way that this shows up here in Kingston in this place. And the lesson from that is that it's always been community, right? Like it's always been finding other people who are like you, and saying, how do we sort of support one another through this question? Because there's going to be doubt, right? There's going to be forces that sort of try to convince you that like your blackness is some kind of other form of blackness. But we were talking about this earlier, Felix. We were talking about the Speed's tour, right? So the streamer Speed was going through the entirety of Africa. Did a 28-day tour of the entire continent, and his relationship with blackness is that he's got an American sort of form of blackness, and he was trying to get to know different ways that blackness shows up in Africa. But also, he's 21 years old. Right? And so for him, the questions that he's posing are going to be fundamentally different than the questions that I'm posing. What I liked about that is he was posing the questions at all. Right? He was trying to sort of like locate himself in this larger sort of constellation and be like, oh, these people are really like me in these ways and not like me in these other ways. My favorite moment of the stream was he was like in this convertible in Algeria, and he was like, this really looks like France. And I was like, man, you're so close. That's. Let me just explain colonialism to you real quick. You know, it is exactly through the willingness to sort of just like pose the question to other people who you feel safe with, you know, and go like, well, what part of this feels like it's rooted in our blackness to you? And I got that wrong. I got that wrong a lot, you know. But there have been writers and actors and podcasters who have helped me along that journey in terms of just being like, oh, that's a reference point that I can use. I like the conversations that they're having. I feel like I have access point to that. I feel like they're posing the same questions that I am posing. But I also like, for me, a lot of that is also internal work, right? Like, why don't people who look like me in Sudan say that they're black? Well, turns out it's colonialism. You know, it turns out that it's like the British history that's kind of been imposed upon us that sort of made us go like, well, we're not black. We're something special. They're black, you know? And a lot, like a gigantic part of the journey of claiming blackness has been about learning about that history, which is like, you can take this sort of ambiguated idea of the history, but you have to disambiguate it and like locate it in yourself. Like find it in yourself and go like, oh, that's how that history shows up. And it shows up now. When I go see my mom and she's having a few friends over, and one of them goes, well, I know we're black, but we're not black like they're black. And I gotta go, no, you know, and they all get mad at me and they go like, oh, you young people. But that's also like, that's what it takes, is like just like disrupting the conversation that's happening in the room. It's been like, guys, I know that we're all from Sudan, but you guys are being a little racist right now, you know? That's how your colonialism and how your colonial mood is showing up. And they all razz me, you know, and we tease one another and we love one another, but also not letting the comment go unchecked. Like, that's my work to do, you know? And everybody will have a different kind of position and relationship to that question and that work. Yeah.
I'll just add to her own question. So what do you say to a lot of people who come to North America and do not subscribe to the idea of blackness at all? And for many of these people, and when I say idea of blackness, I mean the North American blackness, burdened with the history of slavery, colonialism, because I think blackness kind of predated, you know, slavery and colonialism. But they come here having been Zulu, Ndebele, maybe Hausa, Yoruba, Amharic, and so on, and they have to subscribe to this idea, and they don't even know what it means. Would we say that it's a sellout to stand out of this whole blackness constellation, or What do you really say to people like this who are really trying to figure it out? Should I hold on to my identity to make sure that I perpetuate it, or should I accept something that I'm actually not sure what it is?
That's a big question. It is, it really is. I guess I would say two things. I would say, one, you're right. You know you're right. You know that the idea is constructed, that the meanings that are attached to it, they're not real, right? Like that race always and has been, from time, a construct. But also it's real in the ways that it operates here, because there's enough people who make it so, right? And so the meaning of the people who are behind me, you know, I think about Prince, I think about Jimi Hendrix for sure. The meaning of those people is entirely constructed through living through a time where people who really, really believe that race is real and it means something about their identity, and it means something denigrating about their identity, and something inhuman about their identity. It meant that in order for them to just live, let alone succeed, but to just live, they had to contend with that reality. They had to contend with the reality and construct a way to resist it. Construct a way to resist it by saying, well, we're going to claim ourselves. We're going to claim our people. We're going to claim this history, which is like a history of suffering, but it's also a history of joy. And when you sort of find your way to that history, what you're really claiming is a relationship to that history, which is to say, like, I live in a place where this race means something and this identity means something, and therefore I live in a place where the people who have had to fight for the dignity of people who look like me in this place, I don't owe them subscribing to the notion that race is real in that way, but I do owe them an acknowledgement and a thank you for making it a little more possible to survive in this place, because otherwise I wouldn't be surviving in this place. I don't think that means you've got to buy into the concept. I think it means you got to buy into the gratitude it takes for this concept to mean something different than it did, because the crazy thing about history is everywhere you go, it's there, right? You just walked in the room before you walk in the room. And so if we were in a place where that history didn't mean anything, we all wonder what kind of freedom that would sort of enable us. We get up from under these labels, and in a real sense, that would be, that would be what freedom would mean. But as much as I'd like to live in that world, I also know that I don't. And my relationship with that changes every day. Some days I'm like, kind of had it with this. And other days I'm like, no, it's okay to make it easier for the next generation of people who look like me, for this history to weigh a little less on them than it does on me. But you're not wrong to go like, this is crazy. What are we all doing here? That's an entirely fair way to look at it.
Also, though, there is the danger of removing the history, where we have presently, in the country to the south of us, the idea that the Smithsonian museums should not talk about slavery because that's very unpleasant. So let's take all that out and tell cheerful stories. Well, so the history is real, and people are also empowered by knowing what the history is. And so taking it away takes away part of their power. Are there, hello. You're there.
No, I want simply do some comments and a question also. First, I like your your comments about the culture and it's not a product, I would say that Mr. Mitterrand from France, President of France, said exactly the same things to Ronald Reagan. When they have a big G7, he says, stop, the cultural product cannot be part of the WTC, the World Trade Commission. And so, yes, it was exactly the US one, exactly to put all the cultural product as like the same as hamburger. But Mitterrand says, stop, and he said this in French because he was not able to speak in English. So the other things is about the Black months. I am not black, but I discover also in Halifax, Africville, and behind Africville, you need to know that one of the first, so with Samuel de Champlain who came here in 1604, it was Mathieu de Costa. And Mathieu de Costa was a black guy from Africa through the Portugal, and he was fluent in Mi'kmaq, so he was the translator. So it was black people here in Canada since a while ago, and it's not new. So, and Canada was also welcome during the Revolution, the Secession War, with the Liberty Freedom Trail from United States up to Halifax. I walk on this trail in West New Brunswick. You still know, you can see the trail and you can walk on this trail. So this is important history, and Canada was effectively the welcome place for all the slaves who escaped United States. But before, it was already black people. Another not good news, and maybe it's related to Smithsonian, in the British part, the British Empire in Canada, so after the conquest, it was black slave here in Quebec and in the city of Canada, yes. So this was also slavery here in Canada, but this is another story. So, but black people are part also of the Canada history since a long time.
And that's, the recurring question to me is like, how do you make that history more explicit, right? Like because that history is not only there, it's very well documented, right? Like there's no, I don't talk to a lot of people from Nova Scotia who don't know about Africville. I think like that's not a, that is explicit Nova Scotia history. But I do think like once you get outside of Nova Scotia, it's a little dicey. Like I don't think that's a sort of a shared, that hasn't been absorbed into the story of what this country is, right? That hasn't been absorbed into the history of what this country is. But so much about all of these conversations is about saying, we keep having to add things that the folks who wrote the history books kind of left out. And that's a long process. That is like, we're going to be doing that for decades. And also, we're a really young country. And so for us to be a really young country that is having constantly all these questions and be like, hey, I don't think we got that right. I don't think we got that right. I think we might have written that a little bit wrong. Creates a sense of like, oh, what is our identity going to be? What is the story of this country going to be? And I'm very comfortable with the doubt. I'm very comfortable with the sort of influx nature of the story of what this country is. And I think it might be in flux for a couple of generations, and I think that's fine. I think that's all a part of the work of making a country. There is I'm not in a rush, it takes the time that it takes, and I say that like well beyond my lifetime. I think it's just a matter of sort of living in a moment of being committed to being like, well, we're going to tell the truth of this country, including things like Africville, but also including things like the genocide of indigenous people in this country, in order to be able to talk about the truth of what the country is. Because once you have that shared sort of baseline of reality, then you can start building something. And we built it, and it's here, and we're living through it, but also we're kind of editing it as we go, and I think that's okay. I'm very comfortable with the ambiguity that could literally last generations. I don't think there's a danger of that. Actually, I think it's like kind of a beautiful thing. I think we should be a bit more comfortable with it.
Yes, no danger at all. I have had the lovely opportunity over the last few years to judge the history projects for grades 4 through 7 at the Simcoe County Historical Museum. And a number of Lakehead people have also participated in this judging. So there are these grade 4, 5, 6 students. We're talking about slavery in New France, slavery in Canada, missing and murdered Indigenous women. And they don't look depressed or upset. They look informed. And I think, okay, if a grade 5 student can make this a history project, surely the rest of us can. My iPhone tells me that it's time to thank all of you and to thank Elamin very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rita.
Thank you.
And let me thank
So-
both of you very much. It's been an incredible conversation. Rita, thank you so much for your very thoughtful questions, and Elamin for your very thoughtful answers. There's a lot for us all to think about and chew on as we move on with our day. And thank you for the great questions from our audience. Really wonderful. So thank you again, and thank you to all of you for coming to this version of the President's Public Lecture Series, and stay tuned for further ones. All right, good night.
Thanks, guys.